Please welcome our final panel of the day, Professor David Carroll, Brittany Kaiser, Ursula O'Kingertons, and Ravi Naik. This session will be moderated by Vivian Schiller.
Okay, hello everybody. So basically we're standing between you and cocktails. Got it. I didn't actually know that intro was happening, and I'm really glad it did, because one of the things that I was going to start by saying was it's sort of almost hard to believe that the Great Hack, the documentary The Great Hack, which of course is about the Cambridge Analytica scandal, was 5 years ago. In some ways it feels like yesterday, and in some ways it feels like ancient history. So you will remember, and if you didn't remember, you now we're reminded about the Cambridge Analytica scandal. That is the great hack in question. Although I have a question for the panelists about the word hack here. What was extraordinary about this moment was not that it was the first time this was happening, the this meaning that our personal data was being collected, and in this case sold and used for the manipulations of millions of people in multiple countries. But it was the first time that it really came into public consciousness. It was a wake-up call. And so now 5 years later, so much has happened since then. What is the legacy of the film? What is the legacy of the scandal? What's changed since then? And particularly what hasn't? And it's been interesting to note throughout this conference how many of the panels have touched on the issue of data and data privacy and human rights and alternative ways to manage our data. So we're going to get into all of that today. We have with us three, possibly four panelists. Oh, there she is. Okay, four panelists. Immediately to my left is David Carroll, Associate Professor of Media Design at Parsons School of Design, an advocate for data rights, also featured in the film, for legally challenging Cambridge Analytica in connection with the U.S. presidential election of 2016. He is a recovering entrepreneur, in his own words, who co-founded a machine learning startup. Next, we have Ravi Naik. He is the founding member of AWO, the world's leading data rights agency. Ravi heads AWO's leading legal department, advising on data protection and human rights in the digital age, and of course, worked with David on his lawsuit. Then we have Ursula O'Kingertons, is a former journalist and director of communication and partnerships at the Swiss-based Web3 Foundation. She began her career at the Spanish newspaper El País, and from there followed and jumped into the tech industry, where she quite notably joined the New York-based blockchain startup, the Civil Media Company, where we worked together. I was very happily proud of Civil and proud of its status as a failed startup. I would like to believe that we were ahead of our time. We'll just decide that was the case. That was the only issue. And we have, do we have her on the screen? Brittany Kaiser. I can see her in front of me. There she is. So Brittany is an entrepreneur, activist focusing on data protection and privacy. She co-founded the Own Your Data Foundation, teaching digital literacy education, and the Digital Asset Trade Association for legal advocacy and legislative drafting on privacy and blockchain laws. And if you recall the Great Hack, she was notably featured in the Great Hack because she was actually part of Cambridge Analytica. So we have many players and smart people to talk about both the Cambridge Analytica scandal and the film. So David, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay. And Brittany, just a heads up, I'm going to come to you afterwards. So let's start by setting a foundation. And we don't, let's just say for a moment, this panel is not about the film. It's actually about the events of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. So you initiated a lawsuit that was in the film, and it then had a successful resolution. But let's talk about what was the issue at the center. And while you're at it, was this really a hack? I have a problem with the word hack.
Sure. Well, thanks. So great to be on this panel. Hey, Brittany. The origin of the lawsuit was testing a hypothesis that Americans' data had been transferred to the UK, and therefore UK law would apply to our election. The second hypothesis was that the company that did it was a thin facade for a defense contractor, also really easy to prove. And then out of that, I was introduced to my lawyer, Ravi here, who then immediately advised me that it was unlawful what had occurred, and that there was an opportunity to pursue a data protection lawsuit, which probably would have been a slam dunk if the company hadn't declared insolvency and bankruptcy and then was shielded through that moratorium. So the success that we managed was that the Information Commissioner's Office was able to, in the UK, was able to criminally prosecute them for ignoring the order to give me my data. So that was all we achieved. And then it became an insolvency case, which was very complicated and difficult, which I actually did not prevail in, and really illustrated that there is no such thing as data rights as a creditorship. Like you don't, if you had rights when a company was an existing concern, it folds and you're out of luck.
It wasn't an asset of value in that sense.
Or there's no such thing as data creditorship that could be recognized at that stage. So that was significant. And then after the film was released in 2019, in the lead up to the 2020 election, Channel 4 News got a hold of the Trump database from 2020 and then went to the US to show individual voters their actual files. And I was shown my actual file, the one that we had been fighting for, contained all the things that we suspected, including personality scores and sources from data brokering, etc. So in the end, it was a stress test on the whole regulatory apparatus, which didn't succeed completely, and it ultimately was an act of journalism that could have got to the root of it. To your question about was it a hack or not, interestingly, that term was the key thing that Facebook used to dispute the coverage out of the New York Times and the Guardian. And for me, in watching the whole scandal play out and the resolutions play out, it was a hack in the sense that the data was collected deceptively and abusively. And so the original quiz takers were deceptively lured into giving their data, and they were even lied to when they expressed concerns about it. So I think the deception around it all leads us towards thinking that it was a hack because it wasn't above board, it wasn't ethical, and once I met Ravi, I learned it wasn't legal either.
But the point being, Facebook was not itself hacked. They were hacking, in a way, the data and the information of their users in this case.
I would say Facebook allowed itself to be hacked and then disputed it afterwards.
Fair enough. So, Ravi, sorry, Brittany, I said I was going to come to you next, but this is improvisation at work, so I actually want to go to Ravi next. And just to be clear, Ravi is not sitting here because David always has to travel with his lawyer.
Although it always helps.
It does help, yeah.
I'm on the clock right now.
He's going to start whispering your ear, going, but because, of course, you are an expert in these issues in your own right. So what were the legal, you were David's legal counsel nonetheless. What were the core legal claims here? But not to get into the arcana of the law, but more what were the consequences of this being recognized, despite the fact of the insolvency and the way that he ended up getting the data in the end? What was the core claim and the consequences of the breakthrough moment that was represented by this case?
Sure, yeah, I'm glad you said that I shouldn't give a lecture on data protection at this time.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm sure everyone would be better off without that. So when David came to me, he had a very small profile from the company. There was a series of outputs, and we knew there was more information behind it. So we had two core strategies. Firstly, to try to get meaningful transparency over the data. What was there? How did it come together? And secondly, as David's explained, to test the legality of what was happening. And I think on both those fronts, we were quite successful. The regulator of data in the UK said, yes, you need to give the data, prosecuted them for not doing so. But secondly, with the way we tested the law, changed the way political parties use information, political consultancies use information, to say it's not okay to profile people without agency or choice. And that was really important. That really has far-reaching consequential effects. And I think something more foundational happened in the case. From a lawyer's perspective, looking back at how my client grouping has changed. Because David cared, the regulator cared. Because David cared, the world cared. We had a film about this. People stopped saying, I don't really care what happens about my private information. I have nothing to hide, so why should I care? People care. The conversation has changed. And that, I think, is a dramatic consequence. And when I do my work now, we really look at how technology is used from a human rights perspective to put people in the center of how technology develops. And I think that is really important.
Yeah, and we're going to come back to human rights, but it shows the power of one individual and their action
Absolutely.
to have an impact. Sadly, we still hear, I don't care about it, I have nothing to hide, which is such a misreading of what it means to have no privacy online. Brittany, first of all, let's just make sure, you could just say hello so we can make sure that we can hear you.
Hey, everyone.
Ooh, okay, we could definitely hear you. So you were a director at Cambridge Analytica. You were an employee of Cambridge Analytica when all this went down, when the great hack was unfolding, and then you became a whistleblower. So tell us, first of all, we'll talk a little bit later about what you're up to now, but right now what we want to hear is, what was happening on the inside of Cambridge Analytica, and what were you thinking when this was all going down?
Absolutely. So I joined Cambridge Analytica at the end of 2014. I was trained as a human rights barrister in the UK and was really excited to learn as much as possible about data science. I was specifically working in preventive diplomacy, which means how can you prevent crisis or violent conflict before it starts. And my PhD ended up being all about data science. So I went there to learn more and ended up being a part-time consultant there. There were a lot of different types of work going on at that time, everything from defense to commercial to political. And what really drew me in the first instance were some of these data projects that seemed inherently positive. The first ever project that I was shown was a project training NATO militaries on how to identify young people who were being recruited into ISIS and how to run counter-propaganda communications in order to keep those kids safe at home instead of sneaking themselves into Syria. I thought if we can do that with data, this is something that I want to learn. But over my many years there, I saw commercial projects and political projects that started to grow more and more insidious. I'm really glad that David already mentioned the types of apps on Facebook that I think everyone remembers, where you thought you were taking an innocuous quiz about what Disney princess you should really be or what country you should live in. And actually, you were just consenting to not only give away your data, but the data of everyone in your network, your family and your friends, which under no law do you have the ability to consent on behalf of others to giving away that data. So yes, Facebook allowed everybody to be hacked. And it wasn't just the data being taken that was the issue. I saw in a country that we started to explore business development in that Cambridge Analytica was not interested in the laws or regulations of that country. I would constantly call our lawyers to ask if we were able to propose something that a client was asking for, and they would tell me that I was creating too many invoices, that the lawyers were expensive, and the data scientists could tell me what could be done. So I constantly asked, can we please get a data protection officer? Can we please have in-house legal counsel? Every time I was told no, and that I was creating problems for the company financially by continuing to ask for that. So as time went on, we started to see more and more clients, especially Donald Trump, a campaign for president, as well as the super PAC, who not just were using data that was collected without the consent of individuals across the United States, but also was using that data in ways that were inherently abusive of human rights and electoral rights. We saw that data was being used in order to profile people that might not vote if they were shown enough negative content. We were shown that fear-based content was being sent towards people that the data showed were neurotic, and therefore they would make a different political decision if they were shown enough disinformation. in both investigations as well as lawsuits both against Facebook and plenty of other companies who have abused data in similar manners.
So thank you, Brittany. And I just want to amplify two important points you make, because we're going to come back to them as we begin to segue from talking about the past to where we are today. One, it wasn't just the data that if I take the quiz, it wasn't just my data that was being collected. It was every single person in my social graph, whether they consented or not. And that data was used to target individuals because of all the data that was available with messages that manipulated them in certain directions by the Trump campaign, and this was the case with the Brexit campaign as well, to taking certain actions. And we know these things are effective. Ursula, I just want to bring you in. We're going to talk a little bit in a bit about data solutions, which I know you're eager to talk about. But when all of this was going down, you were and still are a recovering journalist. So talk a little bit about the impact of this film and the Cambridge Analytica scandal on raising awareness about how our data is collected and used.
Yes. By the way, I'm sitting here not because we used to work together. Because
That's right. I was thrilled to see you on the panel. I didn't even know.
Yeah. So yes, I just wanted to bring you a fun fact because I was working at Civil that time, but I was collaborating for the El País newspaper in January of 2018. And I was doing a lot of Facebook Lives, because Facebook, they're not just taking my data. I was also giving it free content. Facebook, it was big for a lot of media companies, like all of them that were collaborating with Facebook just because of Facebook was paying or were given the distribution platform. So to be honest, I didn't really know what Facebook was going at that time. I knew there was something sketchy on Facebook, but I didn't know the exact thing that they were doing it. So I was in Davos in 2018 and doing a Facebook Live, and right in front of the Davos headquarters in Davos, I was invited to be part of a press news conference with a person from Cambridge Analytica. And I was like, this is interesting, right before the Davos Facebook headquarters. And that was Alexander Naik. He was launching a token proposal. I don't want to say here because I know that we are not going to go there yet, but I just wanted to mention it, like how ironical are the times, because I was at Facebook doing free content. Meantime, right in front of Facebook headquarters, it was Alexander Naik. And that time, right after that, I came back, I talked with my editors, and we're like, there is something here, but we don't know exactly what. And right a few weeks later, this Cambridge Analytica scandal exploded on The Guardian and the New York Times. So yes, Vivian, it was a big, big, big moment for all of us, and it was the first time ever that we were conscious of what was going on Cambridge Analytica, especially on Facebook.
So thank you, Ursula. So let's now sort of move quickly to today and talk about, since then, there's been so much attention, the story techlash, whatever that means. I'm not sure I believe that there's such a thing, really. When we talk about some of the key elements from the big revelations that we talked about, that our data is being collected without our consent. In this case, Cambridge Analytica, Facebook would say that they didn't authorize it or they fixed it, that data is being sold to third parties, that it's being used to manipulate us with either misleading information, false information, or information that presses our emotional buttons. Are all of these, one would think after a scandal of this time, with all of the hearings, all of that would have gone away, has it?
Well, the practices of Cambridge Analytica were typical of the industry, and the only unique aspects, I thought, was that it was internationalized and that it was related to the defense industry. Like, that was the new thing. So I think that the internationalization of the voter targeting industry has hopefully been interrupted, and also greater awareness of keeping a firewall between, kind of war on terror, psychology operations, and the rest of the apparatus are important to maintain. But we also have seen significant regulatory and legislative activity that comes out of the scandal, and things, especially in the United States, that would be inconceivable without Cambridge Analytica, that it created the conditions to have legal solutions finally put on the table. As one of Brittany's colleagues says in The Great Hack, there was always going to be a Cambridge Analytica. It just sucks for me that it was Cambridge Analytica, that the inevitability of this kind of a scandal was bound to happen, and it needed to happen to change the attitudes and pressure the needed change.
Well, I want to come back to you in a minute and talk about what the specific, in Europe and in the US, what has and hasn't happened in a regulatory and legislative front. But Brittany, let me come back to you first. So in light of that, so you're a whistleblower. You said you've testified many, many times. Where do you see, what's your assessment of what has transpired in terms of what data privacy gaps have been closed and where there's still a growing risk, continuing risk?
So I think there have been really interesting developments across three different, I suppose, core initiatives for what I see to solving this problem. The first, obviously, is education and awareness. The second is legislation and regulation. And the third is the development of new technologies that can actually solve the problems of these legacy technologies that we've been using but are obviously broken and not fit for purpose. So firstly, on the education and awareness front, I would say especially because about 1 billion people have seen The Great Hack, I go all around the world, whether I'm lecturing or teaching at schools, universities, or doing corporate or government trainings. I hear people say, when I saw The Great Hack, it was the first time that I thought about how my data is being used, and the first time I thought that I should do something in order to protect myself. I have people from all around the world say, I've sat down and watched this as a family to show this to my children, and now my children are more careful about the way that they use social media. So this education and awareness has really permeated, I suppose, the lax attitude that so many people have had for the past generation, saying that this is the way technology works, and so we just have to accept it. I see a whole new generation of people who actually care and are thinking about the ways that they use technology. We now see schools that are implementing digital literacy education at a national level through the Ministry of Education or Department of Education. And we're seeing more and more schools that have a technology and ethics concentration. Not nearly enough, but it's starting, and we always needed to start somewhere. Secondly, on the legislative...
I'm going to pause you on the second one, because I want to start you. That was an excellent summary of sort of the greater growing awareness. I actually wanted to turn now, and we definitely are going to come back to you again when we talk about number 3. But for number 2, in terms of greater legislation, regulation, Ravi, I want to just come to you to talk about what you see are the most promising actions that governments have taken.
Sure. So I think before we think about new regulation that might be needed, we need to think about what we have and actually where are the deficits and what is the mischief new regulation seeks to fill. So when we think about the laws that we have, when we were looking at David's case, we were using data protection norms, but we were also using traditional, just tortious remedies. We weren't very, very sophisticated. We didn't need the GDPR. The GDPR is an evolution of data protection norms. So when we think about that, we had this international complex reach of the data protection framework, and we were able to really effectively put pressure on the company using laws that we had. And most of those laws are still yet to be fully tested. So I think before we start over-regulating or just running to regulation or legislation, we have to see what the gap is. I think the one very obvious gap is the lack of international harmonization around these protections. And I think that leads to data laundering because people can offshore data to places with lesser protections. And I think we were talking about this in an earlier panel. You have to put the person in the middle of all of this to say, what is the harm? What are you trying to cure? Do you need new legislation and regulation? I think keeping those things in mind are the really important things.
But the EU and the UK have probably arguably been the most aggressive around regulating data. So just give us a very, very top line. What are the key elements of that?
It's very interesting. Obviously, the UK and Europe are very different positions right now. Europe is taking a very progressive and quite clever stance in trying to plug some of the gaps. So, for example, in Europe, my colleagues at AWO are working on drafting new laws to allow researchers to access platform data. In the UK, we have a slightly different approach. We are, on the one hand, trying to regulate online harms. That agenda seems to have stalled because it's not entirely clear what an online harm is. When is something lawful but harmful that needs to be regulated? There's all sorts of fraught questions. But at the same time, this government has committed itself to regressively changing our data protection norms, which is really worrying, because if you're worried about online harms generally, you should be strengthening data protection norms, not trying to revoke.
And we're going to come back to online harms in a minute. And in the US, most of the regulatory heat is really with the states, not at the federal level, for reasons having to do with a lot of dysfunction in American politics these days, among other things.
Yeah, it was remarkable that the state of California, the home of Silicon Valley, was the first state to pass the California Consumer Privacy Act and has already iterated to version 2.0 of its laws. And in many ways, Cambridge Analytica was a kryptonite term that could be used in the discussions to when the question was, oh, regulation will harm innovation, the activists merely had to utter Cambridge Analytica, and then, oh, you're right. So it served as a mechanism to advance what had otherwise been obstructed in terms of passing laws. And it was also a uniquely California thing because it was driven by a ballot initiative, which is unique to California. So it harnessed this public anxiety and created a voter upswell that forced Sacramento to make a law that would be, previously inconceivable in its aggressive way to regulate its most important, arguably, business. And then since California, 4 other states passed laws of varying differences. And so now the problem that industry is rightly worried about, and I would say ordinary people as well, is the risk of a patchwork of different competing laws. And so that has created a strong incentive in Washington, D.C. to pass a national standard. And we did see a very interesting bill come out of committee, the ADPPA, the American Data Privacy and Protection Act. And what I think is even interesting is the word data protection arrived in the United States discourse, where previously we hadn't used that phrase. And I think one of the most significant effects of the scandal and the movie is that it taught Americans about European rights. This idea that you have rights to your data even after it's out in the world. Like, as the American philosophy of privacy is, finders, keepers, losers, weepers, basically. And so it created a notion that we could recapture what was out there. And I didn't even know this was possible until I met Ravi.
And that's the really interesting thing about our case, is this idea that it wasn't just privacy. It was about having rights and control over your information that had been out there, how you're profiled, having agency, because having inalienable rights over your information is a really powerful tool that we exemplified in this case.
Thank you. So Brittany gave us a very, very handy framework. Thank you for that. We first talked about the impact being this growing awareness and education about what it means that data privacy isn't just being someone that doesn't have anything to hide. And then the second pillar, which is about regulation and legislation. Let's now move to the third pillar, which is what are the alternative paths where our data might be protected? And I'll come to you in a minute, Brittany, but I'm going to start with you, Ursula, because this is now the area that you're focusing on in Web3, and so much of that at the center is about protecting data. So explain to us in very simple terms how that works.
Do you want me to explain what is blockchain? Because that's very complicated. But if
Just talk about the data piece. for
Okay,
now, yeah.
okay. So the data piece is basically that on the blockchain space, which is the centralized ledger, they talk about this before. You will own your data. You will take the right of your data and can move it in different places. And we have seen right now, we have seen some projects like Frequency, new social media graph that is going to be launching pretty soon, that they're aiming to decentralize the data of the millions of people around the world, and right now they're going to launch with around 20 million people in December. So we're going to see more of this project. Even Twitter has a project which is Blue Sky. They're aiming to decentralize social media as well for the last 3 years. It's going to be on the hands of Elon Musk, so we shall see. But anyway, the main point of blockchain is to decentralize data. So that means that I will own my own data, and no one will be able to take it. I'll have the rights, and I will be able to move it in different social media or metaverses. Who knows? So that is basically why blockchain or Web3 it will solve. So we are not there yet.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, so in the spirit of that YouTube series, Explain to Me Like I'm 5, are you familiar with that? Explain to me like I'm 5 how you have more control over your data when it's fully public and it's decentralized. How is that not the opposite? Which is, frankly, Elizabeth and the other panel talked about the decentralization of data as actually a human rights risk.
Well, that is a very technical question, Vivian, because blockchains are very technical. These are mathematical cryptographic solutions, and that's why it's decentralized. We have two different protocols, proof of work and proof of stake. On proof of work is Bitcoin. So they're the miners who protects that data, because it's true, you're right, saying that it is decentralized, but who will take care of that data is a miner, that no one can control that data. While proof of stake, the stakers, you can stake your token and secure the protocol. That is Ethereum, for example, and some other blockchains like Polkadot as well. So the decentralization is based on this algorithm, which is proof of stake and proof of work. And just to tell you a fact, Estonia, which is a digital government, in 2008, they adopted blockchain for data integrity, right before Bitcoin was launched. That was very curious, because it's a digital country, everything is on the cloud.
Understand better how that works. Brittany, this has been a big area of focus for you in looking at alternatives to data protection and data privacy, Web3. So give us your point of view here.
Of course. So if you want to look at blockchain on a high level, one of the reasons why we're starting to look at implementing this at an international scale, I would say every Fortune 2000 company is integrating blockchain technology at some level. Most governments are integrating blockchain technology across different departments and ministries. And the easiest way to describe it to people who are not highly technical is to say that this is a database that is secured by cryptography. So it's trackable and traceable every time you make a data transaction. So one of the biggest problems in the Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal was that Cambridge Analytica claimed that it had deleted data, that a Facebook data set. Now, if you are using a blockchain-based system, you would be able to see if that data was transferred and if that data was burned or deleted. So it allows for transparency and tracking and traceability and the ease of auditability. So this is going to make it impossible for companies to lie about what they've done with data, and it's also going to make it impossible for anyone to take your data unless you've consented to it. The way I like to describe this to people as well is think about data ownership, being able to own and control all of your own data, like your property. If you think about it like the Airbnb model instead of the way that the data industry works today. So if you own your data like you own your house and you wanted to rent it out, you would know who wants access to your data, how much they're going to pay you, what they're going to use it for, and before you hand away the keys, you would receive that payment and consent to it. And so that allows all of that easily to be done where you don't share any personally identifiable information. That's where the term digital identity comes in, which means that you would have a public cryptographic key that represents all of your personally identifiable information. You won't have to use your name, address, phone number, email every time you interact online, every time you use a device. Instead, you're just going to use your digital identity, which is a key or a number that has nothing to do with your personally identifiable information. And then you can decide to share data. You can decide not to, of course. If you own a house, you don't have to put it on Airbnb. And if you want to get rewarded for it, that's great. And if you decide not to opt in, that's great too. And then all of the companies that are receiving that data, all of those transactions can be auditable, trackable, and traceable. All of it is consensual. And if that is being monetized, then you will have agreed to a specific amount of revenue that you would like to receive for the data that you're creating. I think a lot of people have started to see the learn to earn or play to earn model that's getting out there, which means that if you are creating data, if you are creating value for a company, then you should be able to receive some of that value yourself. So it's really similar to the way that loyalty points work. If you go to the grocery store and you allow them to collect data on what you're buying, that behavioral data enhances the way that that company does business, and therefore you are rewarded. So instead of the grocery store giving you coupons for 20% off your favorite stuff, what if they just gave you that monetary value? And so if you started to collect that value, that is a really easy way where all of a sudden you have this universal income from participating in the data industry, whereas right now, all of your data is being monetized and bought and sold and traded and used without your consent, even though now it is considered to be the world's most valuable asset. And you as the producer of that asset class are only now starting to be able to have rights to its value. The law that was referred to in California, which has gone from CPPA to CPRA, now says that if companies are monetizing your data, that they have to declare that to you, and you have the right to know that, and you have the right to ask to be paid for that data. So that's an incredible revolution in kind of from education and awareness to legislation and regulation, and now being able to use new technologies to actually enforce those rights like never before.
Yeah, quickly, because I'm going to move on.
I just wanted to be precise, because, I mean, so far, blockchain has been live for the last 12 years, and no one really have been able to scale on business models with any blockchain. We have tried that, and we know that. But the blockchain, as you say, Brittany, is great for all of that. But so far, it's super hard to put all of your data in a blockchain. No one is doing that. What we have seen new protocols like DSMP, for example, that is being created to create new social media for the social graph, to own your social graph. But that doesn't mean that I will put all of my data on a blockchain. First of all, it's slow and it's expensive. So no one is doing it right now as a business model.
It also would require every website or every interaction we have online to be using this same system. I'm going to shift gears because we could go down a deep, deep rabbit hole on this, so we're going to hold on that. I want to come back because we've got to go to questions in just a minute. I said I wanted to come back to the issues of human rights, which we thought was we had just a panel just about an hour ago on this issue. But with regard to data rights, David, one of the things that you have been extolling is that data rights are essential to human rights. So what do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, I think the Cambridge Analytica scandal created an awareness around these issues because we finally imagined a threat to elections and democracy. And then the COVID pandemic arrived, and then we started to think about risks to our privacy related to pandemic response and the use of it as a surveillance tool and the risks therein. And then in the United States, we saw the fall of Roe v. Wade with the Dobbs decision. And so now reproductive health and human autonomy is ultimately at stake, and the data broker industry is now an attack surface for people to be persecuted seeking reproductive care that a business model for targeting bounties was legislated into existence. And so the importance of privacy as an expression of autonomy and a power differential between us and it has become very clear to us since in these past 5 years. So I feel like that new concern is animating a lot of these kinds of discussions and is, reflecting these opportunities, whether it be regulatory or otherwise.
Yeah. Who's on the other side of that? What's on the other side of that?
Well, looking at me there, but I think
you don't have to. Yeah.
Just to pick up on what David's saying there about the power differential, I think this is the really important bit. Human rights sound very arid and very difficult to conceptualize. What it means in practice for individuals is your say in the power balance. It gives you a charter of rights. I think just going to the point that Brittany was saying, I think one of the problems with that philosophy of putting data on the blockchain is this idea that you can consent to all of this, that you could meaningfully give consent to what is being described, because actually consent is a snooper's charter. People don't really consent to these things. Where you get those annoying cookie block pop-ups.
Yeah.
It's all
agree.
It's compliance theatre. Yeah. It's not actual consent. This is why a lot of the companies that now come to us are trying to properly engender rights into what they are providing to a consumer. And actually there is now a value in providing privacy, as we see with what Apple is doing. So I think this idea that it's about power and giving people rights over the way their information is used is the most important, the most fundamental thing that we can do over developing technology.
Okay, we're gonna move to questions now, because we have quite a few good ones. So the first one is, I wish I knew who these were from, but okay. So the first one is, I want to believe that people care more about what happens to their data 5 years on, but do you think convenience still outweighs data control literacy for most members of the public, and how do we change this? Harkening back to these pop-ups that we just want to blow through so we can get on with whatever it is we're trying to do online. How do we change that? Brittany, you've been focused on awareness and education. Do you think that people care more about what happens to their data now? And if not, how do we change that?
Mm-hmm. I do think in general, people care a lot more now than they did before, although we're also dealing with a generation of people who grew up on social media. Many of my friends' children have issues with social media addiction. And that is one of the reasons why I started the Own Your Data Foundation, where we do digital literacy education. We use a curriculum called DQ. So like IQ or Equal Intelligence Quotient, it's the IEEE International Digital Literacy Standard. And that teaches everything from data rights to personal cybersecurity, from countering cyberbullying to screen time management, understanding your digital footprint, digital empathy and interacting with others online. And all of these are an indicator set that gives you your DQ score, which you can learn different pieces of the curricula in order to improve it. So this is being implemented at national levels by multiple countries. And therefore, this is going to be more of a generational thing. I really do believe that the reason why we've targeted at the youngest children is because we need to be teaching children about all of these topics before they have their own device. So we spend a lot of time teaching in middle schools, usually around the time when children receive their first device that is their very own, not something that belongs to the family. And so instilling intelligence about how technology works so that children can make educated decisions on how they use technology, instead of just telling them how to use it, we tell them how it functions, and therefore they can make better decisions about how to safely and securely use it to lead a more successful digital life, instead of constantly being targeted and being put into positions that do not promote their well-being. So I think that's a generational thing. In the near term, it's important for us to be able to give products to people that are already safe. Unfortunately, the operating systems that most of our computers and phones are running on are sharing our data all over the world completely without our consent. So in order to make sure that education and a generational level is not the only thing that we have to fight with, that we actually are able to provide people with technologies that protect all of their personal information. I think that's really the next step, and that's an educational level with corporate executives. And there's a lot of people, including myself, who are working with big corporates specifically to change their own policies and to implement better types of technology into their products, so that we make sure that we are protecting people from the beginning, whether or not they know how the technology works.
Thank you. Thank you, Brittany.
Yeah, to your question about, do people care and has their behavior changed, and related to the question of consent, Apple did something that had the most significant effect to the whole industry. And what they did is, for the first time, gave Apple users an honest choice. Would you like this app to let it track you? And unsurprisingly, only single-digit percentage of people said yes. It was the first time we were allowed to have a real choice in the matter. The cookie consents are dark patterns that are designed to frustrate you. And Apple said, this is a clear yes or no. And in that act, wiped billions off of the balance sheet.
We're seeing that play out with quarterly earnings right now.
That's right. It had the most significant effect on the industry. By far more than anything else.
Yeah.
Just one quick addition on that. This idea of this compliance theater of cookie pop-ups, that framework, what it's trying to get you to consent to, is completely unlawful. We've taken a case that's now going to the European Court of Justice. It's compliance theatre. It is not providing a proper lawful basis to allow this tracking to happen. So I think this industry is under attack because it's fundamentally not lawful and is not what people want. And I think actually it shouldn't be on individuals to try to have this kind of change and make this change. Companies should just act lawfully. And that's an enforcement deficit we're starting to now see in practice.
David, it's interesting, the Apple example, though, I mean, in some ways, yes, how wonderful, what a huge impact. On the other hand, this wasn't from, this was enlightened self-interest on their part. This wasn't an act of government anywhere in the world. It wasn't the act of individuals. It was the act of a private company making a decision to make a certain change that had this big impact.
Of course, it's just business, but it also, as Apple being a kind of platform for other companies, I would say that it helped Apple help other companies achieve legal compliance. So it wasn't purely independent of regulatory considerations. It was a mix of moving the industry towards compliance and capturing market share in the process because it was available to capture.
Yeah, better to regulate yourself before you're regulated from the outside. Next question, considering how precious data is for politicians and social media algorithms that allow the targeting of specific demographics with different political messages, what is required by governments to ensure citizens have access to healthy public debate? This is an existential question, I think, in many ways. What is required, what can governments do to ensure citizens have access to healthy public debate? Who would like to take that on?
I mean, I think it does come to the transparency of your own voter profile. So I mentioned before that Channel 4 got a hold of the 2020 Trump database and then went to the US. And there was one particular clip that I still think about so much where Krishna Guru Murthy found a voter in Milwaukee, a black woman. He showed her file. Is this true? Yes, this is true. Yep. And then it said, you were marked for a deterrence campaign. You were marked to be demobilized from the process. How does that make you feel? And she said, it makes me want to vote even more. And so therefore, you can actually rebalance the power differential through simple acts of, in some way, neutralizing the power of these databases by, for example, passing a law in the United States that people have right to their own data, something that is only true now in 5 states, and not even true yet because not all the laws are in action. So the simplest thing of having right to your own data is something that Americans don't enjoy yet. But if we could achieve that, we could see how it could sanitize some undesirable practices that affect our democracy very directly.
This next question from, I'm going to name, when I get a name, I'm going to read it. Kimberly Goffey, I hope I've pronounced that correctly. Is the advertising revenue-supported model of the internet compatible with data rights? An excellent question because, well, anyway. Or is a new model needed entirely? And aside from blockchain, what might that be? So obviously the advertising model is contingent on data because it's all about the targeting. Ursula, do you want? Well, Ravi, I'll let you start. And then Ursula,
very quickly. So the fundamental thing of behavioral surveillance leading to advertising is probably inconsistent with data protection norms and data rights in Europe, which is the case I'm talking about that's going to the European Court of Justice. So I think that model will change. We at AWO are doing a study for the European Commission about alternatives to this business model, because there really needs to be one, because that revenue stream is so important to what this conference is about.
Go ahead, Ursula.
No, that is a key question, because the main problem with Facebook and social media in general is the ad business-driven model, which is our data. So beside the blockchain, I've been so focusing on blockchain lately that it's hard for me to think about other new models. But just to bring the metaverse, for example, well, like everyone, you like it or not, people are talking about what's next on the metaverse. I have no idea. I don't have all of the answers because we are super early stage. Same with blockchains, are super early stage. It's still evolving. So that is going to be curious to see how this is going to be evolving, because a lot of companies, especially the fashion brands, they're already working with metaverse. So maybe they're trying to create a new business models from something that I don't know yet. But based on blockchain, beside your data, there's a million questions that I can have answered here, but this is not the specific panel for business models. But I would say that this is a moment for us, as Brittany has said, that we have to be educated and we have to be aware that our data is a commodity. So right now, when I'm thinking about this, everyone, even media companies, are trying to experiment with the metaverse. This is a moment for legislations, for us to get to know what is this. My son plays Fortnite, and probably Fortnite, they already have all of his data. So if we don't take actions now, our data will be like lost in 100 years. So basically, it's how to change business models. And the options are open. I don't think that Tim Berners-Lee in 1989, when he created the web, he thought that we would be communicating with CryptoKitties or hearts, you know? So.
No, he certainly, I'm certainly sure that's true. We're just going to close up. We're going to do a quick lightning round, and I mean like lightning, like 10 seconds each. You could just use a few words. What is the most important legacy of the Cambridge Analytica scandal? Brittany, I'll start with you.
Most important legacy of the Cambridge Analytica scandal is the ability in the future for everyone to own their data and therefore own the value that they're contributing to the world's largest asset class. We have the ability for everyone to receive a universal income from their participation daily in technology, and that can change everyone's life and rid us of extreme poverty.
Thank you. David.
Bringing the right of access to the United States. It did not exist before, and now it exists in 5 states, and hopefully all 50 someday soon.
From your lips.
I would say rights are hollow unless they're stood behind, and having people like David stand behind rights and make them real, that's really important.
Excellent. Ursula.
Awareness of that I was being the product on the digital space.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much to all the panelists. Thank you to all of you for your great questions. And